Thank you very, very much, and thanks everyone for being here today. Thanks for our great panelists for joining us. I just make one short comment about the relationship between security and the economy. Is when I was ambassador to Romania, before they became members of NATO, and they were very strongly wanting to get into NATO, public wanting to get into NATO, leadership wanting to get into NATO. And I kept hearing this argument from Romanians that we want to get into NATO because it'll bring American investment to Romania. And I'm in the investment business, my day job. And I'm like, I don't really think so. I think the EU helps a lot. I think there are a lot of reforms, reducing corruption, having a market economy. Those all get American investment. I'm not sure that many people I work with in the United States in the investment business pay that much attention who's in NATO and who's not in NATO. Obviously, we invest in China, we invest in all kinds of places, Russia, that are not in NATO. And then what a Romanian said to me, he got so frustrated, I said, you're saying it won't increase U.S. investment when we join NATO? I said, I just don't think so. I'm just one guy. He said, let me say this, I wouldn't invest in Romania if we don't get into NATO. Which was a big idea, is what NATO meant to many Romanians was security and confidence in their own country. And I think they are related in that sense. So with that introduction, I want to ask our first speaker, Anders Aslund, who many of you have heard read his, well, at least some of his 15 books, definitely his articles. He's been an advisor on the economy to both the Russian government and the Ukrainian government, and is a senior fellow at the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak here again. I spoke to you 3 years ago, presenting my latest book, Russia's Crony Capitalist, the path from market economy to kleptocracy. And that's unfortunately where we are now. Putin has completely destroyed the Russian economy. Everything that was built for 30 years has now been destroyed. We are back to 1991. And this is the perspective of Russia that I would like to start with. Russia today is, as has already been mentioned by Governor Gilmore in the previous session, an authoritarian kleptocracy. And that is the main enemy. And I should also say the general perspective that we should take. I very much appreciated what Ambassador Taylor said, that if Ukraine has been allowed to join NATO, as he pushed very hard for at the Bucharest summit in 2008, then there would not have been a war. And also what General Kellogg said, the US and the West should have armed Ukraine very hard from 2014. That might also have stopped the war. There is a bizarre idea going around Washington that we must not provoke Mr. Putin. This is the wrong thinking. We must deter Mr. Putin. It's the wrong verb that is being used in that sentence. And this is the big thing that I want to put to you before I talk about the economic sanctions. I should also say that I think that the US administration, both parties, by the way, are not perfectly right. This is the right policy that we are pursuing towards Ukraine today. And also, the Ukrainians think, according to a recent opinion poll, to 93% that they will win the war. And as was discussed in the previous panel, the Ukrainian aim is now to take back all territories, including Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and also Crimea. Crimea, you can say it's a bit of a moot point, but yesterday in the Financial Times, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmitry Kuleba, that I think very highly of, made that point very clearly. And why? Well, Ukraine has lived with 3% of its eastern territory being occupied by Russia. Before this war started, 14,000 Ukrainians had been killed there. This is a cancer. This is not a frozen conflict. This is a low-intensity conflict that was pursued for 8 years. Ukraine is not going to stop there. And fortunately, the US and the UK administrations are now saying, go ahead. You have heard these phrases, what is game? President Biden has said so very clearly, Ukraine has to win this war. And then the journalists immediately asked, what does win mean? And Biden and others respond, that is up to the Ukrainians to answer to. It's not up to me, it's they who are fighting the war. So Ambassador Taylor mentioned that with the American artillery now, Ukraine has taken back substantial areas in the north around Kharkiv and cut off the Russian supply line from Belgorod to Kharkiv. And the US heavy artillery makes all the difference. The Ukrainians have taken it a bit easy recently because they don't want to waste lives, while the Ukrainians claim that they have killed 26,000 Russian soldiers. Might be slightly exaggerated, but only slightly. During 10 years in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union lost 15,000 dead soldiers, and that was considered contributing reason to the end of the Soviet Union. So, what is the role of economic sanctions? It is, as was also cited in the previous session on the by Secretary of Defense Austin, it is to weaken Russia. And you can say that the 2014 sanctions were substantial. The general view is that it took off 1 to 1.5% of GDP each year, but Russia has not grown since 2014. My assessment is rather that it's 2.5%, twice as much as it generally assessed of GDP that was deducted each year. So these sanctions were much more effective than the Russians think, because of course they want to play it down, say we are strong, we benefit from import substitution. We all know that import substitution is bad economic policy. So the new sanctions, we agree that one will talk more about what the financial sanctions about here, on the energy sanctions. The new sanctions will, according to general assessment, cost 10 to 15% of GDP this year. I think that it rather will be 15–20%. The Russian Minister of Finance, which is of course the most cautious, say -8%. The central bank says -12%. So this is the Russian ballpark, and double those numbers, and we'll come to what is realistic. So the first big chunk is the financial sanctions, and I don't go into details as one will talk about that. My guess is that alone takes 10%. There's no access essentially now for Russia to international finance. The second big chunk that is difficult to predict, that is the trade sanctions. Today, or immediately after the invasion, the US prohibited the export of semiconductors and a lot of other things to Russia. What does that mean? You need semiconductors for everything. So Russia today can't produce cars, tanks, missiles, and there are also a lot of chemicals that have been prohibited. So Russia can't produce hygiene products of any kind or print paper. All these require the inputs. And the Russian economy was before this quite well integrated to the global economy. So we should expect the blow to be much harder than to other economies. When President Trump introduced the tough sanctions on Venezuela in 2019, GDP fell by 36%. You can say that the Venezuelan economy without any sanctions would fall 60%. The US actually did for the 3 previous years. But when President Trump imposed the tough sanctions on Iran, Iran was already used to a lot of sanctions. They had already all kinds of compensatory mechanisms. And you know, there's this wonderful place to buy just nearby. That's the best smuggling place in the world. So they could get a lot of products through Dubai. In 2 years, the GDP fell by 15%. And that's, so to say, the sheer minimum what we should expect. So this is big. So then, what is the, to weaken the Russian economy so that it can't pursue any further? And I think that's perfectly doable, given that you heard from General Keller how awfully the Russian military are performing, and the Ukrainians think that they can beat it and are doing so as we speak. And the other part is that Putin is likely to fall. He has two massive falls. Russia has not suffered such a loss in a war since the Russia-Japanese War in 1905, which was the last time that Russia lost its flagship, which is of course something to sort of celebrate. And the other is that the factor is that the economy in Russia is now literally collapsing. And the third thing is we're seeing lots of infight between the security services. In particular, FSB seems to have said that it was idiocy of Putin to try to invade Ukraine. And therefore, it seems that the FSB has provided all information to the United States. And that's why we saw that the United States was so imminently involved months before the invasion. And right now we have seen at least 7 top businessmen in Russia committing suicide after having first killed their families with knives and axes, while not having any blood on their bodies when they have hanged themselves. So we can see that these are FSB orders, allegedly ordered by Putin. This is a regime one can't talk to. This is really a Hitlerite regime. Any conversation with Putin is meaningless. And to make an agreement with a man who has violated every international agreement that Russia has done for the last 30 years, that's amazing. Thank you. Sorry for speaking too long.
Well, you didn't speak too long, but that was really cheerful. For that perspective, very interesting and very helpful. Our next panelist will talk about energy. It is Lucian Pugliaresi, who has a deep background in government, National Security Council, so many agencies, State Department, Energy, Interior, and EPA, and now heads the Energy Policy Research Foundation.
Okay, great. Great to see others. Yeltsin days, that's how far back some of us go. Let's give up the second slide, slide 2. In the short period of time I have here, I just want to kind of hit on the fundamentals of what my main point is, and this is as follows. The Biden administration has done a very good job, I think, at organizing NATO, confronting the Russians, keeping the arms flowing. But in terms of energy policy, he is undermining the national power we have to address the Russian crisis through, my view, not aspirational, but delusional adherence to something called the energy transition. I'm going to show you a few pictures on this to kind of make my point, but we have this is part of a longer term project we have with a bunch of defense planners, what we tend to call failure modes of the energy transition. It's a little more sophisticated than that. Slide 4. So this is really how the world uses energy today. And you can see that it is still largely driven by fossil fuels. And the notion that you, in the next 30 years, can transform the world economy, not just the OECD, but the non-OECD, from this to an era of net zero, as I said, it's not aspirational, it's delusional. Okay, next slide. Now you might think that we've been spending a lot of money on wind and solar and transition, and we have. And these shows you all the plans going back to the 1980s to transform the US economy, particularly the power sector, away from fossil fuels to wind and solar. Today, after billions of dollars, about 4% of US primary energy consumption is wind and solar. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So the fundamental flaw in the administration's policy is they want to eliminate the production of North American oil and gas before we have a substitute. Well, we've tried this in the drug war, it didn't work too well. And by the way, it doesn't work very well for oil and gas. You don't get rid of the fundamental legacy fuels unless you have some substitutes for people to go to. Next slide. And this is one of the problems, because as you can see here, you're just substituting one set of energy security concerns for another set. You cannot go to electric vehicles, solar, wind, all these exotic technologies, very expensive technologies, transition to the fuels of the future without these critical materials. Next slide. Now, you might think, as many people in administration have said, that, well, we have to stop oil and gas because they're stranded assets. I won't bother you with this, with the details of this. This is from a friend of ours up at the Stern School, Paul Tice. But basically, if you look at the shape of the investor-grade bond curves, you look forward at the bond curves, and this was done before the run-up in prices. There was no evidence. These are very conservative investors going out 10, 15 years. There is no evidence that oil and gas is a stranded asset. In fact, the bond market tells us that they're quite valuable. And by the way, this morning, Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon are starting to say, well, you know, maybe we overdid this ESG stuff. Okay. Now, let's go to slide 10. This shows you the destinations for all Russian crude and petroleum products. Russia produces about, for the world market, around 7% of the requirements of liquids petroleum. I'm not talking about gas now, but liquids petroleum for the world market. Removing that from the world market is a big lift. It causes a lot of pain on the world oil market. However, you know, under some circumstances, we can expand and over time deal with that. But next slide. But we have to quit abusing the North American oil and gas production platform. We have something called the chart because it's coming out today. But you can see here, if you take North America, we are exporting 2 million barrels a day to the world market, about 10 BCM, 10 BCF a day, which is 100 BCM, which is about a substantial, maybe 2/3 of the total volume of exports that Europe is now receiving from Russia. In fact, the US has the capacity to expand our exports from 100 BCM to 200 or 300 BCM. We have massive reserve base. The reserve bases in the Marcellus alone look like Saudi Arabia. They're producing natural gas, but they look like Saudi Arabia. That's how fast those well rates are, how big those well rates are. And it's very interesting. I'm usually told, I go to a lot of industry meetings with the governments there, people, I'm usually said, you know, please don't complain about the leasing program and stuff. So I try to be quiet. But I was at a meeting with Senator Manchin, and he got up and said, look, I'm not doing anything until you approve the pipelines, till you restart the leasing program, and you stop this ESG nonsense. And by the way, I'm not paying for charging stations. Lithium prices dropped that night. I looked up when I got home. So the bottom line of my sort of presentation to you is one more slide. I'll just leave you with this one. And I have a huge amount of data here. I won't bore you with that. Between 2009 and 2019, the United States, not just not North America, the United States provided 80% of the incremental demand in oil production. 80%. In the absence of that, what you're seeing now would look like is a picnic compared to what it would have been in terms of prices. And the reason oil prices are so high and that we're having such struggle with gas prices is because the world economy still runs on fossil fuels. And the notion that you can easily transition, that it's just a question of policy, is just kind of mind-boggling. It is not. It's an extremely, extremely difficult task. And the right answer for the administration going forward is to actually institute a set of policies that allows a very expansive opportunity for the North American production platform. That's the best thing we can do for our European allies.
Thank you very, very much. Our final presenter is Juan Gerarte, who also served in the executive branch as the first Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, Deputy National Security Advisor, and now is the Managing Partner at K2 Integrity. Welcome.
Jim, thank you. Thanks to you and the council for having me, and honored to be here with Anders and Drew. Great to see you all. Good morning. What I thought I would do is give a framework for how to think about the sanctions regime and the financial measures that are being used, because in my opinion, this is the most aggressive, comprehensive use of sanctions in the context of asymmetric warfare that we've seen in the 21st century. It's part of an evolution of the use of those sanctions over time. I wrote a book called Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare, talking about the shift post 9/11 to the use of sanctions in a more dynamic and aggressive way to deal with terrorism, to deal with rogue states, to deal with issues like proliferation and corruption. But what you see in the Russia-Ukraine context is Europe in some ways joining the battle in terms of the use of financial and economic measures, and starting to think more aggressively in the energy sector as well as to what their vulnerabilities mean and how to think about the way Putin has used energy, oil and gas as a sword and shield against the West. So let me do this. Let me give a sort of a sense of the framework, what's different, give you a little bit of detail as to what's happening, and then a sense as to what's coming next. I don't have a pretty slide. I'm a little jealous of my colleagues, but I'll try to do this quickly. The first thing I would note is sanctions are often thought of in binary terms, right? They either work or they don't. They're either for punishment or regime change. They're either unilateral or multilateral. All of that is, I think, an old orthodoxy that needs to be rethought. Sanctions try to achieve many goals at once. And so certainly the Europeans have talked about the use of sanctions to cripple the Russian economy. But the sanctions and the financial measures are being used for a whole range of reasons. And you can go down the line, both near-term and tactical, all the way to the long-term and strategic. First, they're being used as an element of punishment. If we're not going to fight in the war, what more is there to be done? And sanctions, in many ways, is taking the brunt or the weight of a more aggressive response from the West to Russia. So being used to punish, being used to diminish Russia's ability to fuel its war fighting. You see this in the European debate as to what to do with oil and gas, right? The concern that sending billions of dollars into the Kremlin's coffers is actually not a good thing while they're invading and committing atrocities in Ukraine. It's intended to create internal pressure, perhaps to create fissures within the power base the Kremlin has. It's intended to enable diplomacy, perhaps, to make it more attractive, to turn the sticks of carrots and the sticks of sanctions into carrots at the negotiating table. It's intended to deter further adventurism. So will Putin think twice about his next move, about going into Moldova, in part because of the economic and financial isolation costs that are being weathered. And then finally, the long-term effort simply to weaken Russia, its ability to develop its economy, to be a strong sort of world power. Sanctions are intended to do that, but sanctions don't work alone. Sanctions can't turn back tanks right away, and you've seen a lot in the media. I've been on NPR. There are questions like, why haven't sanctions worked yet? Well, sanctions work over time and in different ways, and you've seen that in terms of the construct of the sanctions. Three things that I think are interesting about the context that are different. I think it's the scope, the scale, and the pace of the sanctions that have been put in place. I think even Russia has been surprised at the ferocity of the sanctions, especially from Europe and Asian allies, as major economies have put in place restrictions on the Russian economy. Two, as I said, Europe really joining the battle, really taking a leading role on its own, not because the US says so or is prompting or cajoling or threatening secondary sanctions, but on their own, coming up with measures and isolation for the Russian economy. And finally, and importantly, the role of the private sector. I think this goes unremarked often. Keep in mind, the private sector, even before many of these sanctions were put in place, were beginning to divest, unwind, cut off ties. Now, not all the private sector. Many companies have continued to do business or tried to maintain operations. But I think the private sector has determined that the reputational Rubicon has been crossed with what Russia's done and has divested. The main gap in the sanctions, of course, has been oil and gas, which has been getting filled over time, but that gap has allowed for Russia to maintain flows of revenue inward, ties to the financial system despite all the efforts to isolate them, and connectivity with some of their institutions internationally. And it's made it harder for our diplomacy. So it's very hard to go to New Delhi or even to Beijing to say, stop doing business with Russia, don't buy their oil and gas, when in fact Europe continues to, and it's still legal in most instances in the context of the international sanctions regime. So that's been the gaping hole and the element of the regime that has been less mature. Just very quickly on what's been happening in terms of the financial measures. In essence, what the measures that have been put in place are trying to do is to isolate the Russian economy and to unplug the elements of the Russian financial system from the international global financial order. Debt and finance is no longer allowed in most cases. Investment has been restricted. Russian banks have been targeted for the most part, with some exceptions. There's been the move to take Russian banks off the SWIFT bank messaging system. This is like the switchboard of the international banking system. So you take a bank off, they can no longer operate internationally, at least legitimately. And finally, going after Russian state institutions, including the central bank reserve, which has been a dramatic and important step, taking at least half of the foreign reserves off the table for the Russians, which then doesn't allow them to use that as leverage or backstop for the Russian economy. So it's an unplugging and an isolating of the Russian economy, again, with some holes and gaps because of the oil and gas exceptions. There's the export controls and trade restrictions, which I won't get into, but that has longer term implications in terms of the Russian economy and modernization. And finally, importantly, and I think this is important for this group, and to Andrew's great work and research over time, a real paradigmatic shift in terms of the view of Russian corruption and kleptocracy. So a key part of the financial and economic measures has been the targeting of oligarchs and their assets. Now that's not new. This dates back to 2014, and certainly there's been investigations of corruption and things. But this is now an all-out campaign as part of the sanctions effort to go after Russian oligarchs, to find their assets, to actually seize and capture, so the hunt for the assets. And you've seen this with the yachts being captured in Barcelona and Cyprus and other places. And that's being combined with then the sanctions. So the Department of Justice, the Treasury have been putting out more designations, more actions tied to both sanctions evasion and the business operations of the oligarchs. Very quickly, what's next? You've seen aggressive enforcement around the sanctions themselves. So even Sunday, you had board members of Russian banks being named. You had facilitators for sanctions evasion. You're going to see more of that, much more aggressive enforcement. You're going to see oil and gas affected. You see that from Europe. And you're going to see more of a debate around secondary sanctions, especially if there's a sense of leakage of the sanctions regime. The one wild card here, of course, is Russian countermeasures. You saw them hint at this with the shut off of oil and gas or oil to Poland and Bulgaria as a sort of a shot across the bow. And they've put in place measures to make it harder for the private sector to unwind or divest, actually making it very hard and uncomfortable for the private sector. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll leave you with the notion that this is going to be an ongoing campaign. And it's now, I think, a part of the broader conflict with Russia longer term. This isn't just an element of diplomacy or a tactical tool. This is now being seen by most actors as an element of a conflict. And so you're going to see more and more action in this space.
Thank you very, very much. Let's open up to questions. Best views. Go.
The microphone has all.
Oh, I see. Your voice is curious. What are the best we can?
A quick question for Anders Aslund and a quick question for Juan Zarate. Anders, there's been some reporting recently that the very able governor of Russia's central bank, whose name I can't pronounce. That she has cleverly performed her role in such a way as to help stabilize Russia's economy. And then there's a recent article, I think, on API on Russia's economy being kind of getting back on even keel fixed forever. Could you describe that and assess it for us, and whether that's vitiated your point about Russia's economy having been totally destroyed and knocked back 30 years? And Juan, quick question: the banks that have not been decoupled from SWIFT, why are there these gaps? Which ones and why?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I'm very critical of Governor Nabiulina, and I think that this is a typical example of somebody who used to be liberal and is therefore still respected among Russian liberals. She should not be. What she has done is really work for Putin. Putin's great aim has been to get maximum reserves. So Russia now, when the war started, had $641 billion of reserves. Fortunately now, the G7 had frozen $360 billion of these reserves. And a major policy aim now should be to confiscate it. President Biden is good on way to do so, I think. And then give it to reconstruction in Ukraine, where Russia probably has destroyed values for $200 million, not counting human lives and the loss of the economy. She has close to 500 banks, and this is her main claim to fame. But did she close the right banks? Well, many banks, most of these banks certainly needed to be closed. But it has also been a matter of corporate reading. And three top bank regulators were sacked quietly in 2016 from the central bank. And they had then consolidated these failing banks into three major private banks. And all three went under in the fall of 2017 with losses of $30 billion. So it looks to me as she is part of a technocratic system, and she has not tried to make Russia wealthier, but she has tried to make Russia safer for Putin's war.
It's a great question. 7 banks originally in March were taken off the SWIFT system. So VTB, VEB, Bank Russia, or banks. Just a couple of days ago, the EU announced they want to take 3 more off, including Sberbank, which is a major bank, as you know, and it's been designated by OFAC in particular. The other 2 are Credit Bank of Moscow and Russia Agriculture Bank. The reason they haven't all been put on is really twofold. One is the oil and gas trade. So specifically, Sberbank and Gazprom Bank have been kept into the system to facilitate the trade and financing of oil and gas deals. I think the second is the complexities of unwinding, in particular, Western banks and correspondent accounts tied to those banks. And so you have HSBC, you have Citibank, you have major Deutsche Bank, you've got major Western institutions that, from a banking perspective, have to carefully unwind either the relationships or the transactions or the contracts in ways that I think make it difficult. So I think there's been some carve-outs for that reason. But I think there's going to be more pressure to de-SWIFT, as it said, more and more actors. And I would note, by the way, in 2014, when the SWIFT debate was happening in Congress, Russian officials said they would consider that an act of war, right? And it wasn't taken. It's been taken today.
Thank you. Yes.
So based on what you know about the sanctions, how long will it take for Russia to say uncle?
Great question. Who would like to dive in on that one?
I don't know what the timing looks like, but I think it's gonna be threefold. One, it's gonna be a combination of taking battlefield losses that are just, not sustainable, seeing a Russian economy that can't weather the short-term sort of storm, and they have done a pretty good job of boosting the ruble, for example, but that will end. So I think in the midterm, once you start to see the real weakening of the Russian economy, that's the second part. And third, I think the isolation of Russians from the Western private sector is critical. But none of that happens overnight, and feeling the effects of all that, I think, is months, not weeks. And it's hard to tell how that ultimately affects Putin's mindset.
Yeah, I just wanted to make first a plug for Juan's book, Treasury's War. I read it with great interest many years ago, and I think that this is the best first book on the role of the treasury in national security. So it's really a great exploration. But on the question here, the alternative today, as I see for Russia, is to North Korea, complete isolation, if Putin managed to stabilize, or Putin falls because the system is destabilized. So I would rather say hit hard now before he can stabilize the regime. We can see that he's dead frightened to be shot or poisoned by his closest people. So put it all on now. If he survives this year, probably we will face another North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, or Zimbabwe under Mugabe, where everything stabilizes. So don't allow him to stabilize.
Right, and I'd just like to say one thing. I think actually, sort of to follow up on that, what the administration should be doing is, they should stop this nonsense. They should restart the offshore leasing program. They should go ahead and immediately treat this like a war, a sort of war footing. They should have emergency procedures with FERC to approve pipelines. They should, we need to make the whole energy security establishment in the US much more expansive to demonstrate to our allies, look, we're there for you. We can deliver the gas, we can deliver the oil. But they're stuck in this view that they can do this transition and this at the same time. They cannot.
I want to ask one quick follow-up question on that. Let's say the administration follows your whole policy.
Right.
How quickly?
So this, okay, I know the question. How fast can you get these supplies out, right?
Well, a little more nuance on that.
Right.
It's how fast can America up its production and delivery so that how fast can Europe cut off taking Russian oil and gas?
So you first have to change expectations, right? Because you can also move crude oil and gas supplies through time. Right? That's why we have stocks and storage. But right now, right, the policies are, well, if you listen to Granholm or you listen to, we just want you to produce for a little while the crisis is. Well, you cannot build a $20 billion LNG facility for a little time.
Fair enough, but realistically, what do you say to the
I think we
European
I think we could probably increase production over the next 2 years by 2 million barrels a day in terms of crude oil. That's not enough to do it, but other people, we can change, we have to sort of, we might have to start treating the Saudis a little differently.
Okay, there are multiple pieces.
There's a lot of pieces, there's a lot of things we can do.
Thank you. Yes, Ambassador Colton.
You didn't mention China's role in this. I'm sorry. You didn't mention China's role in this and their financial strength. And so my question is, are they sufficiently motivated enough to save Russia, to integrate them more into an Eastern style of economic relationship that will allow this to go on considerably longer?
Great question, Mr. Messer. I think this is a fascinating part of this saga, because I think China is not putting its chips on the table for Russia at this point. And so what you're seeing, what you can read in open source material, is the Chinese not backfilling directly. They're not cutting off Russia. They're certainly not weighing in on sanctions. Right? They never liked the use of sanctions. But they are not backfilling. And I think this is a real risky moment for the Chinese for a couple of reasons. They're already challenged with what they're doing internally with their own state-owned enterprises, technology, data, and their launch of the digital yuan, et cetera. They're challenged in essence to the American-backed financial system. That's put to a certain extent at risk if they weigh in with Russia, they provide a backfill, they become the sanctions evasion sort of economy. That puts them at risk. And I think that's why you've seen not just the Chinese government itself be quietly reticent. We've seen Chinese entities operating in places like Singapore and the West openly say, look, we are going to comply with the sanctions. So this is a difficult moment for China, and I don't see them backfilling fundamentally Russia, especially given Russian isolation.
Yeah, let me just reinforce that a bit further. After Ericsson and Nokia, they said that they are not going to deliver any telecom equipment to Russia any longer. Huawei immediately stopped. And Union Pay, the credit card company, works with non-sanctioned Russian banks, but not with sanctioned Russian banks, and so on, as one said. So the Chinese are dead frightened. Yes, on oil, they are refusing to take extra oil deliveries from Russia, while India does so now.
Thank you. Yes, Louise?
Just quickly, we've been talking about the effect of government sanctions. Oh, sorry. We've been talking about the effect of government sanctions on banks. We have been talking about it. At last, government sanctions on business banks, et cetera, et cetera. What about the private sector companies pulling out of Russia? What about the athletic associations refusing to let Russians engage in it? What kind of effect is this going to have? And is this all designed to promote an atmosphere in Russia for regime change?
Yeah, thank you. I thought of mentioning that, but the amount of time, this is enormously important. So what we are seeing now, what I didn't mention is transport sanctions. So shipping, railroad, road transportation, air transportation from Europe to Russia are all being sanctioned. And it's becoming extremely dangerous for companies to deal with Russia. First, you have the sanctions risk, then you have the finance risk. A lot of assets have now been lost because the Russian market has collapsed. And then you have reputation risk. So more than 1,000 companies, according to this professor, Jane, have stopped having relations with Russia. It's not good for your reputation. And most of these companies have 2 to 5% of the sales in Russia. So it's significant, but not important for them. And this means also that you can't get insurance in Russia. So therefore, it's becoming so almost impossible to deal with Russia. It's not only that you are a bad person if you deal with Putin's Russia, but you're also losing your money.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that they will have no engineering or skill sets or technologies for the Arctic or for LNG. They're out of the LNG business, except what they have now. Chinese might be helpful there, but I think they're basically out of it. Sophisticated in the LNG business.
Louise, it's a great question. It's why I mentioned the private sector as a key element of sort of what's happening in this episode. To me, it was a very interesting footnote here, because as the Western economies and economies in Asia worry about ESG principles, right, anti-corruption principles, anti-money laundering principles, all these are heightened expectations of transparency, accountability. You have this rogue behavior, which is in direct opposition. So I think part of the reason you saw the private sector so quickly reacting is there's this heightened sensitivity. You know, we worry about diversity on boards. How about doing business in a country that's, invading, pillaging, committing atrocities in a neighboring country? So the ESG world and those heightened expectations have met the reality of these rogue regimes, and it's caused a real kind of cognitive disconnect, and it's forced the private sector to begin to divest. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
What you got there? You got.
First of all, I just want to thank the council for inviting me today. I'm one of the 2 Catholics public policy fellows, so it's great to be here and to hear your talk.
Just to follow up on Ambassador Oliver's question, what's different now? Why is the world so unanimous, really, in many respects, in its opposition to Russia? Why do we have the private sector so engaged so quickly? Why haven't we seen the same type of response in Syria or Crimea back in 2014? And do we think this model could be replicated in the future to hopefully end conflicts sooner? Thank you.
Well, I'm both the US and Swedish citizens, so I think that this is a question for me. As has been mentioned before, it's Europe that has reacted. And previously, I've been fighting for more sanctions against Russia since 2014. And it has always been the US that has led, and Europe, particularly Germany, that has been dragging their feet along. Not everything went different. So the US was stunned the 24th of February that Europe all of a sudden said not only SWIFT, this connection with SWIFT, but also freezing the central bank reserves, which the Russians had not prepared for. They had moved money from the New York Federal Reserve to Germany and France, because you know these are very reliable pro-Russian countries, and all of a sudden it was different. Europe was shocked to see that Putin started a war that really looked like Hitler's attack on Poland in 1939. That's how it was read and understood, and there were so many people who had not expected it. Well, there were other people like me who had expected it. So therefore, you had both groups coming together and said, now we must act. And of course, it's also, this is Europe. It's a part of Europe, and therefore we have to react. And amazingly, almost instantly, the European Union adopted a rule that any Ukrainian is allowed into the European Union, gets residence and work permit for 3 years, and all social rights, no questions asked. So Europe has then received about 5 million Ukrainians in no time, and in particular Poland has probably received 2.5 million Ukrainians. I mean, the languages are so similar so that they understand each other pretty much in any case. So I don't think that this would be true of anybody else, possibly with regard to Belarus, where we saw a similar reaction after the attack, Lukashenko's repression. But Syria is different. Syria is not a European country, and I think that here we see how bad it is that the West has not reacted against authoritarian kleptocracy, but against what is happening in its own area. So you have a certain amount of hypocrisy. I would not say with regard to Ukraine, but that the West did not react against Russian terror in Syria. So I think that was a serious mistake. You could also say what happened in Chechnya, because this is the third case where we see that it's the terror bombing the civilians, focusing on the hospitals and the schools. And as the Ukrainian soldiers now say, we shoot Russian soldiers. They are so afraid of us, so they shoot our civilians, etc.
Just to add to what Andrew said, I completely agree with what he said. For the private sector, this I think was an accumulation of risk, right? So over time, you had not only 2014 in Crimea, you had cyber issues and election interference, you had corruption, you had the poisonings, you had beginning crescendos in, outside of war zone, outside of war zone near Aleppo, which, horrific, but were not sort of fully imbibed by the private sector. But these were things that the private sector and sanctions were beginning to accumulate. And so the invasion came somewhat unexpectedly by some. The private sector, in many cases, said enough is enough. IKEA, for a long time, for example, was having trouble operating in Russia because of the levels of corruption. Easy for them to say, that's it, right? It's sort of the straw that broke the camel's back in some cases.
Let me just add, Sweden and Finland, because of the war in Ukraine, are now applying for becoming members of NATO. Finland has decided, Sweden will do so on the 15th of May.
Commissioner Gilmore?
My question is going to be whether the three of you think that the sanctions ultimately will work. I'm in favor of this. I've written that I don't think we should be buying and stacking all of these people. So I agree with that. But the question is, what are we trying to achieve here? What is the political goal that we're trying to achieve with the sanctions? I recently reread about the history of the Japanese War in the 30s. And Roosevelt continued to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, but the Japanese never changed their national goal. They never changed it. And once the sanctions began to kick in on the Japanese, and they didn't change their goals, Pearl Harbor was inevitable. So the question I've got for you is, will this sanction regime, as effective as you all have described it, achieve our political goal, which is for them to change their national goal? Or are we getting ready to spark a war?
We don't know. But it's no longer a deterrent. And we can say that the deterrent after 2014 failed, because time and time again you heard this sanctions from hell, and then nothing happened. So clearly Putin did not believe that sanctions would come, or that they would be serious. Now the aim is different. It is to weaken the Russian economy as fast as possible, but with two aims really. What we are saying openly, that this is to weaken Russia militarily so it can't pursue the war, or Secretary Austin said. The second is hoping that there will be some social unrest, and that we can't understand. And often we get the opposite reactions, as these four current super sanctioned countries look very stable: Iran, North Korea, previously Zimbabwe, and now Venezuela. So sanctions tend to be more effective economically than politically, and we don't have a clear view of it, because often people support a leader when they see the problem is the sanctions and no fee. But I think in the short term, it's more likely to be politically successful than in the long term with regard to Russia.
Well, the Russian people are being told that their misery is being caused by the West, and specifically the United States. So they're preparing them mentally not to yield, but to double down. Maybe that's what I'm curious
I
about.
think that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah, indeed. But also the Russian authorities now are lying, watch a bit on Russian television, and they are lying incredibly. So there's no nothing that has to deal with reality. Just to take one example of terrible, they are one of these talking heads that they are now running 24 hours a day. They said, for once, Victoria Nuland said something that was true. She said that we are pursuing a genocide in Ukraine. That's exactly what we are doing. We have to kill them all. This is the kind of language you hear on Russian television.
Yeah, that's why.
Lou, you want any comments on this?
Well, actually, I think the Japanese comparison might be a stretch, because the Japanese did have highly motivated troop levels. They had much more resources. They could engage in the war, and it's true. You know, an atomic bomb for them to surrender, but I don't think the same situation is with the Russian military to actually engage in a long-term fight.
Governor, it's a great question. The difficulty here with Russia is this is a large economy. It has resources that countries need and the economy needs, and we're trying to isolate it at a time of war. I think it's very hard, as I said before, to ask sanctions to carry the full weight of stopping the war and converting what Putin has in mind. And I think sanctions are often most ineffective. I'm a sanctions hawk, so, you know, the Treasury Department for a long time. But they're ineffective when you have leadership that is intent with the national program or a program of national identity to move forward with the program. We've seen this with North Korea, their nuclear program, to a certain extent Iran and Russia. But what you can do is have sanctions affect their ability to operate, their reach, and then the context of the decision making. And I think that's really where the sanctions can pressure, because I do think there are fissures within the system that are going to continue to put pressure. And the more the sanctions bite, and they will, that will impact the decision.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Foley.
Hi, right now the Europeans are pushing very hard to get all of the countries in Europe to stop buying Russian gas. However, I'd like to get your thoughts of how realistic that is, because there are certain economies such as Hungary and Slovakia who have 90% of their energy is Russian gas or oil. And it would, to turn off that or to discontinue it, it would destroy them economically. It would destroy those two countries. So how realistic?
Actually, the oil is not a major problem in the
It's the
sense
gas.
that,
It's the gas.
yeah, and the gas actually, for both of those economies, are not substantial volumes either. It's really the whole, it's the big uses in Germany and stuff. And part of what can happen is, it's not just gas. They're going to have to move to more of a portfolio of energy sources. I mean, what the Germans did was just nobody would have, they engaged in a strategy of they got rid of the nukes, right? And they got rid of the coal of it and had this very narrow view. We can transition to the fuels of the future with wind and solar and a very unstable power system. So the gas became extremely important. Now they're beginning to adjust to this. They're adjusting this and saying, okay, well, we're going to include other fuels in our transition. We're going to slow down. But yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem, but it can be made up. These gas supplies can be made up, but it'll take time.
My suspicion, which is expressed in the media, is that Viktor Orban is heavily overtaken from Moscow. So this is very much a question of his personal business and not of the national issue. The country that is really dependent on Russian gas is Germany. And 55 BCM of 150 BCM exported to Europe each year goes to Germany. And the reason here is one person, Gerhard Schröder, who has been Moscow's most well-paid agent in Europe since 2005. And this is legal. He gets something like $1 million from Moscow each year, $600,000 for being chairman of Rosneft, the state oil company, and then he's the chairman of the shareholders committee of Nord Stream 1 and previous Nord Stream 2 when it existed. And inexplicably, the other political forces in Germany accepted this.
No hidden corruption there.
Perfectly transparent. And I can take a contrary example. Sweden has always refused to buy gas from Russia because we consider it a danger to our national security.
Thank you. I think we're ready to wrap this up. Are we, Ambassador Hughes? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh,
I said Swedes are smart.
Oh, there you go. Okay, on that note, Swedes are smart. Oh. Ambassador Mason, we're gonna give
A quick question for the self-identified sanctions policy.
That's good seeing you again, by the way.
Where, in your view, Juan, have U.S. sanctions policy proved to be the right ones and got what we wanted? I'm a Latin American, and I've seen Cuba. I'm looking at Venezuela, looking at poor, impoverished Nicaragua. But where in the world? Because there's a debate going on.
Yes.
And I'd like to hear your view.
3 quick answers, because I know this, I'll be super quick. You've seen success in various historical cases, South Africa, Iran brought to the table the episode I had in my book in North Korea in 2005, which really constricted them. We let that go too quickly. There are episodes of more targeted sanctions that have worked, whether you're talking about oligarchs or businesses. So those work. Where they have difficulty is massive regime change, right? So the maximalist use of sanctions. But I would say even in the Cuba context, which President Obama called a failure in terms of sanctions, I would disagree with him respectfully, because sanctions at the time they were being pressed and at the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, actually constricted Cuba's ability to engage in nefarious activities in Central America, Africa, and other things that they were trying to do aggressively, as you know, in the 70s and 80s. And so
But they haven't stopped.
they haven't stopped, but they haven't been as robust or as aggressive, in part because they had less means. And so that's what I started with, which is sanctions can be applied for a spectrum of uses. And success can be defined in different ways. If you're defining it as regime change, you're going to be disappointed in most cases.
And this panel has been a success, so thank you all very, very much.